During a walk with her father, a powerful millionaire CEO, a 7-year-old girl witnesses 2 police officers humiliating and assaulting a homeless man without cause. Unable to forget what she saw, the little girl later shows up unexpectedly at the man's trial, interrupts the courtroom, and delivers a heart-wrenching speech before the judge and everyone present. Her words reveal the truth, clear the man's name, and expose the officer's corruption. Moved by his daughter's bravery, the CEO makes a life-changing decision that transforms the destiny of the forgotten man. I love seeing this community grow. Feel free to introduce yourself below. Jonathan Richardson commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals with the same ease most people ordered coffee, but these precious Saturday morning walks with his daughter remained the highlight of his week. "Daddy, look!" Emma pointed excitedly at a red cardinal perched on a nearby bench. "Mrs. Patterson says cardinals are messengers from heaven. Do you think Grandma sent him to say hello?" Jonathan smiled, his heart warming at his daughter's innocent wonder. Since his mother's passing 6 months ago, Emma had found comfort in believing that her beloved grandmother was still watching over them. "I think Grandma would love that you remember her stories about birds, sweetheart." Emma had inherited her grandmother's compassionate heart and her mother's keen sense of justice. At 7 years old, she possessed an unusual ability to see people, really see them, in ways that most adults had forgotten how to do. Where others saw obstacles or inconveniences, Emma saw human beings with stories, feelings, and dignity that deserved respect. As CEO of Richardson Industries, one of America's largest construction and development companies, Jonathan lived in a world of profit margins, quarterly reports, and strategic acquisitions. But Emma's presence in his life served as a constant reminder that success meant nothing if it came at the expense of basic human kindness. "Daddy, why don't we walk this way today?" Emma tugged gently toward a less-traveled path that wound through the park's quieter sections. "I want to see if the ducks are still at the pond." Jonathan checked his watch. They had plenty of time before Emma's piano lesson, and allowed his daughter to guide their route. This was their special time together, away from the demands of his company and the pressures of maintaining their high-profile lifestyle. Here, in the simple act of walking with his child, he could remember what truly mattered. As they rounded a corner near a cluster of old oak trees, Emma suddenly stopped walking. Her grip on his hand tightened, and Jonathan followed her gaze to see what had captured her attention so completely. 50 yards ahead, partially hidden by the morning shadows, 2 police officers had cornered a homeless man against a park bench. Even from this distance, Jonathan could see that the situation was escalating beyond a routine interaction. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice carrying a tremor of concern. "Those policemen look angry." Jonathan's first instinct was to steer Emma away from what was clearly an unpleasant situation. In their world of private schools, gated communities, and carefully managed experiences, his daughter rarely encountered the harsher realities of urban life. Part of him wanted to preserve her innocence for as long as possible. But Emma was already walking forward, drawn by an instinct to understand what was happening to the man who looked so frightened and alone. "Emma, we should probably—" "Please, Daddy, something's wrong." The homeless man appeared to be in his 60s, wearing layers of worn clothing that spoke of too many nights spent outdoors. His grey beard was unkempt, his face weathered by years of hardship, but his eyes held a gentleness that Emma noticed immediately. The 2 officers, both younger men with the bearing of those who had grown cynical too quickly, were clearly agitated about something. Their voices carried across the morning air, harsh and demanding. "I told you to move along, old man. This bench isn't your bedroom." "I'm sorry, officers," the homeless man replied quietly, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had endured this conversation many times before. "I was just resting. I wasn't bothering anyone." "You're bothering me," the first officer snapped, moving closer in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. People like you make this park unsafe for families. Emma looked up at her father with wide, questioning eyes. Daddy, why are they being mean to him? He's not doing anything wrong. Jonathan felt the familiar tension that came when his daughter's innocent observations forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the world they lived in. How could he explain that sometimes those sworn to protect and serve didn't always live up to their oath? As they watched, hidden partially behind a large tree, the situation took a decidedly ugly turn. The second officer, who had been silent until now, suddenly grabbed the homeless man's arm and jerked him roughly to his feet. "Time to go, Grandpa. And if we see you back here, you'll be spending the night in jail instead of on our clean park benches." The homeless man stumbled, his weathered hands reaching out for balance. The small bag containing what appeared to be all his worldly possessions tumbled to the ground, spilling clothes and a few personal items across the walkway. "Please," the man said softly, "let me just gather my things." But instead of allowing him the basic dignity of collecting his belongings, the first officer kicked the bag further away, scattering the contents even more widely. "Oops," he said with cruel sarcasm. "Looks like you've got some cleaning up to do. Better hurry before we decide to arrest you for littering." Emma gasped audibly at the deliberate cruelty, her small hand flying to cover her mouth. But it was what happened next that would be burned into her memory forever, creating a moment that would change not just her understanding of the world, but the trajectory of several lives. The homeless man, moving slowly and carefully to avoid further antagonizing the officers, began to gather his scattered possessions. As he reached for what appeared to be a small framed photograph, the second officer stepped forward and deliberately placed his boot on the man's hand. "I said, hurry up!" The homeless man cried out in pain, his weathered face contorting as he tried to pull his hand free without making the situation worse. But the officer pressed down harder, clearly enjoying the power he wielded over someone who couldn't fight back. "Daddy," Emma whispered, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "They're hurting him." "Why are they hurting him?" Jonathan felt his own anger rising, but also his protective instinct for his daughter. This was exactly the kind of situation he had spent years shielding Emma from, and now she was witnessing it firsthand. But before he could decide whether to intervene or retreat, Emma made the decision for him. "Stop it!" she called out, her young voice cutting across the morning air with surprising strength. "You're being mean to him." The two officers turned toward Emma's voice, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to surprise and then to annoyance. The homeless man, still trapped beneath the officer's boot, looked up with a mixture of gratitude and concern for the child who had dared to speak up for him. "Emma," Jonathan said quietly, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder, "we should let the officers handle this." But Emma Richardson had inherited more than just her grandmother's compassion. She had also inherited the Richardson family's stubborn streak that had made them successful in business for 3 generations. "But Daddy, they're being bullies," she said, her voice carrying the crystal-clear moral certainty that only children possess. "Grandma always said that good people help others who can't help themselves." Officer David Martinez, the one with his boot on the homeless man's hand, straightened up slowly. At 28, he had been on the force for 6 years, long enough to develop a cynical edge that he justified as necessary realism. The presence of witnesses, especially well-dressed ones who might have influence, complicated what had been a simple exercise in clearing undesirables from the park. "Little girl," he said with forced politeness, "this man is a vagrant who's been disturbing families, trying to enjoy the park. We're just doing our job." Emma looked at the homeless man, who was using their distraction to slowly gather his scattered belongings. She noticed that his hands were shaking, whether from fear, cold, or pain, she couldn't tell. But she could see in his eyes the same look she had seen in her grandmother's eyes during her final weeks, the expression of someone who felt invisible, forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. "What's your name?" Emma asked the man directly, ignoring the officers entirely. The homeless man looked surprised that anyone, especially a child, would address him as a human being worthy of basic courtesy. "My name is Thomas, little miss. Thomas Mitchell. I'm Emma. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Thomas." Officer Jake Sullivan, Martinez's partner, shifted uncomfortably. At 26, he was newer to the force and still occasionally troubled by situations like this. But he had learned to follow Martinez's lead, especially when it came to dealing with the homeless population that their sergeant insisted they keep moving. "Look, kid," Sullivan said, attempting to sound reasonable, "your dad's right. This isn't something you need to worry about. Why don't you go play on the swings or something?" But Emma was studying Thomas Mitchell with the intense focus she usually reserved for her favorite storybooks. She noticed that despite his worn clothes and unkempt appearance, he spoke politely and had kind eyes. She noticed that the photograph he was clutching was of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. Most importantly, she noticed that he was scared but trying not to show it. "Mr. Thomas," she said, "are you okay? Did they hurt your hand?" Thomas looked at his hand, which was already beginning to swell where the officer's boot had pressed down. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't you worry about an old man like me. Adi, Grandma always said that people who are hurting sometimes pretend they're fine so others won't worry. But it's okay to say when something hurts." Her words, spoken with such innocent sincerity, seemed to affect not just Thomas, but also Officer Sullivan, who looked away uncomfortably. Jonathan Richardson found himself in an impossible position. His protective instincts wanted to remove Emma from this situation immediately, but his daughter's moral clarity was forcing him to confront a reality he had long been able to ignore. That the comfortable world he had built for his family was surrounded by injustices that he had simply chosen not to see. "Officers," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, "perhaps we could—" "Sir," Martinez interrupted, recognizing the expensive clothes and confident bearing that marked Jonathan as someone with influence. "This doesn't concern you or your daughter. We're handling a routine matter." Routine. Emma's voice rose with indignation that would have been amusing in other circumstances. "Hurting people is routine?" She turned to her father, her eyes blazing with the righteous anger of someone too young to accept that cruelty could be normal. "Daddy, you always tell me that my words matter, that I should speak up when something is wrong. This is wrong." Thomas Mitchell, who had managed to gather most of his belongings while the attention was focused on Emma, slowly struggled to his feet. His face showed the pain of movement, suggesting injuries beyond just his hand. "Little miss," he said gently, "your parents raised you right, but these officers are just doing their job. I don't belong in a place like this where good families come to enjoy themselves." "But Mr. Thomas," Emma said, her voice catching with emotion, "everyone belongs in the park. That's why it's called a public park, right, Daddy?" The simplicity of her logic hung in the air like a challenge that none of the adults could easily dismiss. Officer Martinez, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the scrutiny and aware that other park visitors were beginning to notice the commotion, decided to reassert his authority. "All right, that's enough. Sir, you need to move your daughter along, and this vagrant needs to clear out now." But as Martinez reached toward Thomas, whether to grab him or simply gesture, Emma did something that surprised everyone present. She stepped forward, placing her small body between the officer and the homeless man. "No," she said firmly, her 7-year-old voice carrying more moral authority than many adults achieve in a lifetime. "You can't hurt him anymore." The tableau that formed in that moment, A small girl in her pristine weekend clothes, standing protectively in front of a homeless man, facing down two police officers while her wealthy father watched in amazement, would be seared into the memory of everyone present. It was also the moment when Thomas Mitchell, a man who had been invisible to society for so long that he had almost forgotten his own worth, remembered what it felt like to have someone believe he deserved protection. And it was the moment when Emma Richardson began to understand that her comfortable world existed alongside realities that demanded her attention, her voice, and her courage. What none of them could know was that this encounter was just the beginning of a chain of events that would lead them all into a courtroom, where Emma's words would carry far more weight than anyone could imagine. The tension of the moment was broken by the arrival of a park ranger whose radio had picked up reports of a disturbance. Ranger Patricia Williams, a woman in her 40s with the calm demeanor of someone skilled at diffusing situations, approached the group with professional caution. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes taking in the scene. Two agitated police officers, a well-dressed man and his young daughter, and a homeless man clutching his scattered belongings. Officer Martinez immediately stepped forward. "Just dealing with a vagrant, Ranger Williams. We've got it under control." But Emma, still standing protectively near Thomas, spoke up before the adults could craft their version of events. "They hurt Mr. Thomas's hand on purpose," she said clearly, "and they kicked his things around and were being really mean to him for no reason." Ranger Williams looked at Thomas's swollen hand, then at the officers, her expression neutral, but her eyes taking in details that suggested this wasn't a routine interaction. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, and Thomas looked surprised that she knew his name. "I've seen you around the park before. Have you been causing any trouble today?" "No, ma'am," Thomas replied quietly. "I was just resting on the bench. I know I'm not supposed to sleep here, so I was just sitting, trying to stay warm." Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why isn't Mr. Thomas allowed to sit on the bench? We sit on benches all the time." It was another of those questions that children ask with devastating innocence, cutting straight to the heart of societal hypocrisies that adults have learned to accept without examination. Jonathan knelt down to his daughter's level, acutely aware that his answer would be heard by everyone present. "Well, sweetheart, it's complicated. The park has rules about—" "But he wasn't sleeping," Emma interrupted. "He was just sitting, and even if he was sleeping, why is that bad? Don't people get tired?" Ranger Williams had been observing this exchange with growing interest. In her 15 years working in the park, she had witnessed countless interactions between police and homeless individuals. Most followed a predictable pattern of harassment disguised as law enforcement. But this situation was different, primarily because of the presence of a child whose moral clarity was forcing everyone to examine their assumptions. "You know what, Emma?" Ranger Williams said, addressing the child directly. "You're asking really good questions, and you're right that people get tired and need to rest." Officer Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "Ranger Williams, we don't need to explain city ordinances to a kid. The bottom line is, vagrants can't loiter in the park." "Actually," Ranger Williams replied evenly, "the bottom line is that this is a public park, funded by taxpayers, and Mr. Mitchell has as much right to be here as anyone else, as long as he's not violating any actual laws." Emma looked up at her father with vindication in her eyes. "See, Daddy, Mr. Thomas does belong here." Thomas Mitchell had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about him as if he were a human being with rights that he had almost forgotten such conversations were possible. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said softly. "If the officers want me to leave, I'll go." "But why should you have to leave?" Emma asked, turning to face him fully. "You're not hurting anyone. You're not being loud or messy. You're just existing, and that's not against the law, is it?" Officer Martinez had reached the end of his patience. The situation had spiraled far beyond his control, and the presence of witnesses who seemed sympathetic to the vagrant was making him feel exposed and defensive. "Look, this is ridiculous. We have reports of homeless individuals harassing families in this area. We're responding to legitimate complaints from tax-paying citizens who want to enjoy the park safely." "What families did Mr. Thomas harass?" Emma asked, with the persistence of a child who sensed she wasn't getting the whole truth. The question hung in the air because, of course, there had been no harassment. The officers had approached Thomas simply because his presence offended their sense of how the park should look. Ranger Williams stepped into the silence. "Officers, can you provide me with the complaint numbers for these reports? I'll need to file my own incident report about this interaction." The request for documentation clearly made both officers uncomfortable. Martinez glanced at his partner, then back at the growing group of onlookers who had been drawn by the commotion. "We don't need to justify our actions to park rangers," Martinez said defensively. "We're handling a law enforcement matter." "Actually," Jonathan said, speaking up for the first time since Emma had taken charge of the situation, "I'd be very interested to know what law Mr. Mitchell has broken." As the CEO of a major corporation, Jonathan was well versed in legal matters. More importantly, his daughter's courage was forcing him to confront his own complicity in a system that allowed this kind of treatment of vulnerable people. Thomas looked at Jonathan with surprise and gratitude. It was clear that he had expected the wealthy man to side with the officers, not question their authority. "Sir," Officer Sullivan said, attempting to appeal to what he assumed would be Jonathan's natural alliance with law enforcement, "surely you understand that we need to maintain order in public spaces. Vagrants make families uncomfortable." Emma's head snapped up. "Mr. Thomas doesn't make me uncomfortable. He's nice and polite. The only people making me uncomfortable are you two." The brutal honesty of her statement seemed to affect everyone present. Here was a child from a privileged background, exactly the type of family the officers claimed to be protecting, and she was making it clear that she felt safer with the homeless man than with the police. Ranger Williams made a decision. "Mr. Mitchell, why don't you come with me to the ranger station? I'd like to make sure your hand gets looked at, and we can discuss your rights regarding park usage." Thomas nodded gratefully, but as he turned to follow the ranger, Emma called out to him, "Mr. Thomas, wait!" She ran up to him and, before any of the adults could stop her, wrapped her small arms around his waist in a gentle hug. "I'm sorry they were mean to you," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You seem like a really nice person, and you deserve to be treated nicely." Thomas Mitchell, a man who hadn't experienced human kindness in months, felt tears welling up in his eyes. He gently patted Emma's head with his uninjured hand. "Thank you, little angel. You've got a good heart." As Emma stepped back, she looked up at him with the serious expression of someone making an important promise. "Mr. Thomas, if those policemen try to hurt you again, I'll tell everyone what I saw. I'll make sure people know the truth." Neither Emma nor Thomas could know that this promise would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Within a week, Thomas Mitchell would be arrested on charges that would threaten to destroy what little remained of his dignity and freedom, and Emma Richardson and Emma, despite her father's attempts to shield her from the harsh realities of the legal system, would find herself compelled to keep her word in the most dramatic way possible. 3 days after the incident in the park, Jonathan Richardson was reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office when his assistant knocked urgently on the door. "Mr. Richardson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation involving that homeless man your daughter met in the park." Jonathan looked up from his papers, immediately alert. "What kind of situation?" "He's been arrested. The news is reporting that he attacked 2 police officers and stole money from a park vendor. They're saying he's a dangerous criminal with a history of violence." Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He reached for the remote control and turned on the large television mounted on his office wall. The local news channel was indeed running a story about Thomas Mitchell, but the man being described bore no resemblance to the gentle, frightened person Emma had tried to protect. Thomas Mitchell, 62, was arrested yesterday evening on charges of assault on a police officer, theft, and disturbing the peace, the reporter announced over footage of Thomas being led away in handcuffs. Police say Mitchell has a history of erratic behavior and represents a danger to families using the park. The report included brief interviews with the two officers from Saturday morning, Martinez and Sullivan, who described Thomas as aggressive and unpredictable. This individual had been harassing park visitors for weeks. Officer Martinez told the camera, "When we attempted to question him about stolen merchandise found in his possession, he became violent and attacked my partner and myself." Jonathan turned off the television, his mind racing. The story being presented was completely at odds with what he and Emma had witnessed. More troubling still, he realized that Emma would inevitably learn about Thomas's arrest, and she would have questions that he wasn't sure how to answer. His fears proved justified when Emma burst into the house that evening, her school backpack still on her shoulders and her eyes blazing with indignation. "Daddy, they arrested Mr. Thomas. Sarah's mum told her mum. And Sarah told me at school. They're saying he hurt those mean policemen, but that's not true." Jonathan set down his newspaper and pulled Emma onto his lap, trying to find words that would satisfy her need for truth without completely destroying her faith in justice. "Sweetheart, sometimes when adults have disagreements, it can be hard to know exactly what happened." "But Daddy, we were there. We saw what really happened. The policemen were hurting Mr. Thomas, not the other way around." Emma's voice carried the frustration of someone who knew the truth but felt powerless to make others believe it. "Emma, the legal system is complicated. There are lawyers and judges whose job it is to figure out the truth. Then we have to tell them. We have to tell the lawyers and judges what we saw." Jonathan felt the weight of his daughter's expectations. In her world, truth was simple and justice was automatic. She couldn't understand why witnessing injustice wouldn't be enough to correct it. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. We're not involved in this case." "But we are involved. We saw it happen. Daddy, you always tell me that telling the truth is the most important thing. Isn't this the same thing?" That night, after Emma had reluctantly gone to bed, Jonathan found himself unable to concentrate on work. His daughter's words echoed in his mind, challenging assumptions he had carried for decades about how the world worked and what his responsibilities were to people beyond his immediate circle. He began researching Thomas Mitchell's case, using his business connections to learn more about the charges and the legal proceedings. What he discovered made his unease grow into genuine alarm. Thomas was being represented by an overworked public defender who had 15 minutes to prepare for each case. The evidence against him consisted entirely of the testimony of officers Martinez and Sullivan, who claimed they had found stolen goods in Thomas's possession and that he had become violent when questioned. Most disturbing of all, Jonathan learned that Thomas had been homeless for only 8 months after losing his job as a maintenance supervisor when the company he'd worked for went bankrupt. Before that, he had been a productive member of society for 40 years, with no criminal record beyond a few traffic violations. The stolen merchandise, a watch and some cash, had allegedly been taken from a park vendor's cart. But when Jonathan discreetly investigated further, he discovered that the vendor, Miguel Santos, had never reported anything stolen and seemed surprised to learn that his testimony was being used in the case. "Nobody stole nothing from me," Miguel told Jonathan when he approached the man's cart the next day. "I know Mr. Thomas. He sometimes buys a coffee from me when he has a little money. He's always polite, always says thank you. I don't understand why they say he stole from me. Armed with this information, Jonathan faced a crisis of conscience. He had the resources and influence to investigate this injustice thoroughly, possibly even to help Thomas mount a proper defense. But doing so would inevitably involve Emma more deeply in a situation he had been trying to shield her from. His dilemma was resolved when Emma cornered him at breakfast the next morning. "Daddy, I had a dream about Mr. Thomas last night. He was in a cage, and he was crying because nobody would listen to him. You always tell me that dreams sometimes show us what we need to do." Jonathan looked at his daughter's earnest face and realized that she had already made her choice. The only question was whether he would support her decision or force her to carry this burden alone. "Emma, if we try to help Mr. Thomas, it's going to be difficult. People might not want to listen to you because you're a child. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Emma nodded with the determination that had become familiar to him over the past week. "Daddy, Grandma always said that doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would do it all the time." That afternoon, Jonathan Richardson did something he had never done in his successful business career. He made a decision based not on profit potential or strategic advantage, but on the moral clarity of a 7-year-old girl who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. He called his personal attorney and began the process of inserting himself and his daughter into a legal case that would test everything they believed about truth, justice, and the power of speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. What Jonathan didn't know was that Emma had already been preparing for this moment in her own way. Writing down every detail she could remember about that morning in the park, determined to make sure that Mr. Thomas's story would be heard by someone who mattered. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would pit a child's unwavering sense of right and wrong against a system designed to protect its own, regardless of the truth. The courtroom of Judge Margaret Hartwell was known for its efficiency and no-nonsense atmosphere. At 62, Judge Hartwell had presided over thousands of cases ranging from petty theft to serious felonies, and she prided herself on maintaining order while ensuring that justice was served fairly and swiftly. On the morning of Thomas Mitchell's preliminary hearing, she expected nothing more than a routine proceeding. The case seemed straightforward. A homeless man with escalating behavioral problems had finally crossed the line into criminal activity. The prosecution would present their evidence, the public defender would make a perfunctory defense, and she would likely bind the case over for trial, with the defendant remaining in custody due to his lack of ties to the community. What Judge Hartwell didn't expect was for a 7-year-old girl to change the entire trajectory of her morning. Emma Richardson had spent the weekend preparing for this moment with the intensity she usually reserved for school presentations. She had written down every detail she could remember about the incident in the park, practicing her testimony in front of her bedroom mirror until she could recite it without hesitation. Jonathan had tried to prepare her for the formal atmosphere of the courtroom, explaining that there would be many adults wearing serious expressions and speaking in language that might be difficult to understand. But Emma seemed remarkably calm about the prospect, displaying a confidence that both impressed and worried her father. "Remember, sweetheart," Jonathan said as they climbed the courthouse steps, "we're just here to observe today. If there's an opportunity for you to speak, I'll handle all the arrangements with the lawyers first." Emma nodded, but Jonathan noticed she was clutching a folded piece of paper in her small hand, her written account of what had happened in the park. Thomas Mitchell looked drastically different from the man they had met 5 days earlier. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, making him appear smaller and more vulnerable. His injured hand was bandaged, but he moved carefully, suggesting other hurts that hadn't been visible during their brief encounter. When Thomas's eyes found Emma and Jonathan in the gallery, his face registered surprise and something that might have been hope. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement before turning his attention back to his court-appointed attorney, a young man named David Chen, who looked overwhelmed by his caseload. The proceedings began predictably. District Attorney Sarah Walsh presented the state's case with practiced efficiency, calling officers Martinez and Sullivan to testify about Thomas's alleged attack and the stolen merchandise found in his possession. Officer Martinez took the stand first, his account painting Thomas as an aggressive vagrant who had become increasingly hostile when questioned about his activities in the park. "The defendant was agitated from the moment we approached him," Martinez testified. "When we asked him about reports of harassment from park visitors, he became belligerent and refused to cooperate with our investigation." Emma shifted in her seat, her small hands clenching into fists as she listened to Martinez describe an encounter that bore no resemblance to what she had witnessed. Officer Sullivan's testimony was equally damaging, describing Thomas as unpredictable and potentially dangerous, and claiming that the defendant had lunged at Martinez when they attempted to search his belongings for stolen goods. "We had reports of missing merchandise from park vendors," Sullivan told the court. "When we found items matching the description in the defendant's possession, he became violent and attacked my partner." David Chen's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. As a public defender handling 30 cases simultaneously, he had neither the time nor the resources to thoroughly investigate the officer's claims. His questions were routine, designed more to fulfill his legal obligations than to challenge the prosecution's narrative. "Officer Martinez, did you file a report immediately after this alleged incident?" Chen asked. "Yes, sir. Standard procedure." "And you claim my client attacked you without provocation?" "That's correct. We were simply doing our job when he became violent." Judge Hartwell was preparing to move forward with binding the case over for trial when Emma Richardson stood up in the gallery. "Excuse me," she said in a clear, strong voice that carried easily across the courtroom. "That's not what happened." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hartwell looked up in surprise, her gavel halfway to the bench. "Young lady," she said gently but firmly, "this is a courtroom. Spectators are not permitted to—" "But, Your Honor," Emma interrupted, stepping into the aisle, "they're lying. I was there, and they're not telling the truth about Mr. Thomas." Jonathan immediately stood up, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Your Honor, I apologize for my daughter's outburst. She's just—" "No, Daddy," Emma said, turning to face her father with tears in her eyes. "You said that telling the truth was the most important thing. Well, Mr. Thomas is going to jail because those policemen are lying, and if I don't tell the truth, who will?" Judge Hartwell studied the small girl who had just disrupted her courtroom. In 30 years on the bench, she had developed an instinct for reading people, and something about Emma's demeanor suggested this was more than a child's attention-seeking behavior. "Bailiff, please maintain order," Judge Hartwell said quietly. Then, addressing Emma directly, "Young lady, what's your name?" "Emma Richardson, Your Honor, and I saw everything that happened in the park last Saturday. Those officers weren't protecting families from Mr. Thomas. They were hurting him for no reason." District Attorney Walsh stood up immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Children cannot simply interrupt court proceedings to offer testimony." "I understand that, Counselor," Judge Hartwell replied. "But this child clearly has something she believes is important to say. Mr. Chen, does your client know these individuals?" David Chen looked confused and unprepared for this development. I believe this is the first time my client has encountered potential witnesses, Your Honor." Thomas Mitchell had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. The little girl who had shown him kindness in the park was now risking embarrassment and official disapproval to defend him in court. Judge Hartwell made a decision that would prove pivotal for everyone involved. Councillors, approach the bench, she said quietly. After a brief conference with the attorneys, she returned her attention to Emma. Miss Richardson, what you're attempting to do is very serious. Court testimony must be given under oath, and there are legal procedures that must be followed. However, given the gravity of your claims, I'm willing to hear what you have to say. She looked at Jonathan. Mr. Richardson, do you support your daughter's request to testify? Jonathan looked down at Emma. Seeing in her eyes the same determination that had driven her to stand up to the police officers in the park, he realized that this moment had been inevitable from the instant she decided to speak up for Thomas Mitchell. Yes, Your Honor. My daughter witnessed the incident in question, and she has a right to tell the truth about what she saw. Emma walked to the witness stand with steady steps, her folded paper clutched tightly in her small hand. The bailiff approached with a children's Bible, and Judge Hartwell explained the oath in terms a 7-year-old could understand. Emma, do you promise to tell the truth about what you saw, even if it might make some people upset? Yes. Ma'am, I promise. District Attorney Walsh looked uncomfortable as Emma settled into the witness chair, which had to be adjusted so she could reach the microphone. This was not how she had expected this routine hearing to proceed. Emma, David Chen began, finally finding his footing as Thomas's defender. Can you tell us where you were last Saturday morning? I was walking in the park with my daddy. We do that every Saturday after breakfast. Emma's voice was clear and confident, carrying easily through the courtroom. And what did you see when you got to the park? Emma unfolded her paper and consulted her notes. And I saw 2 policemen being mean to Mr. Thomas. He was sitting on a bench, not bothering anyone, and they told him he had to leave. What happened next? Mr. Thomas was very polite. He said he was sorry and that he was just resting, but the policemen kept being mean to him anyway. Emma looked directly at Officers Martinez and Sullivan. They said people like him made the park unsafe for families, but that's not true. Mr. Thomas was nice. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Emma continued. Then they made Mr. Thomas stand up, and his bag fell down, and his things spilled everywhere when he tried to pick them up. One of the policemen kicked his bag and made the mess worse on purpose. Emma, Chen said gently, did you see anything else happen? Emma's eyes filled with tears as she recalled the most troubling part. The policeman stepped on Mr. Thomas's hand with his boot and pressed down hard. Mr. Thomas cried out because it hurt. But the policeman just pressed harder. A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Hartwell looked sharply at the officers, her expression suggesting this testimony was affecting her perception of the case. What did you do when you saw this? Chen asked. I told them to stop being mean to Mr. Thomas. My grandma always taught me that you should help people who can't help themselves. District Attorney Walsh stood for cross-examination, clearly hoping to discredit Emma's testimony. Emma, you're very young. Are you sure you understood what was happening? I'm 7, not 3, Emma replied with dignity. I know the difference between helping someone and hurting them. Isn't it possible that the officers were just doing their job, and Mr. Thomas really had done something wrong? Emma consulted her paper again. Mr. Thomas was sitting quietly on a bench. In America, that's not against the law. The ranger lady said he had just as much right to be in the park as anyone else. Emma, did your father tell you what to say today? No, ma'am. Daddy told me I didn't have to come if I didn't want to. But I promised Mr. Thomas that if anyone tried to hurt him again, I would tell everyone the truth. I keep my promises. Walsh tried a different approach. Emma, you live in a very nice house and go to a private school, don't you? You don't really understand what homeless people are like. Emma's response surprised everyone. I understand that Mr. Thomas is a person just like you and me. He was polite and kind, and he didn't deserve to be hurt. Having a house doesn't make someone more important than someone who doesn't have a house. Judge Hartwell leaned forward. Emma, why is it important to you that we know what really happened? Emma looked at Thomas, who was wiping tears from his eyes, then back at the judge. Because Mr. Thomas is a good person who's had some bad things happen to him. Those policemen lied about him, and if nobody tells the truth, he'll go to jail for something he didn't do. That's not fair. She paused, then added with the moral clarity that only children possess. Grandma used to say that when good people stay quiet about bad things, the bad things win. I don't want the bad things to win. The courtroom was completely silent as Emma's words hung in the air. Judge Hartwell looked at the prosecution, then at the defense, then at Thomas Mitchell, who was looking at Emma with an expression of profound gratitude. Thank you, Emma. You may step down. As Emma returned to her seat beside her father, Judge Hartwell addressed the courtroom. Given this testimony, I'm ordering a full investigation into the circumstances of Mr. Mitchell's arrest. The charges will remain pending until we can determine the truth of what happened in that park. She looked directly at Officers Martinez and Sullivan. Gentlemen, I suggest you contact your union representatives. This hearing has raised serious questions about your conduct. As they left the courthouse, Thomas Mitchell approached Emma and Jonathan in the hallway. Miss Emma, he said softly, I don't have words to thank you for what you did in there. Emma looked up at him seriously. You don't have to thank me, Mr. Thomas. I just told the truth. That's what people are supposed to do. It was a simple statement that would echo in Jonathan Richardson's mind for weeks to come, ultimately leading him to make a decision that would change not just Thomas's life, but his own understanding of what it meant to be truly successful. The investigation that followed Emma's testimony moved swiftly. Within days, security footage from nearby businesses corroborated her account, showing Officers Martinez and Sullivan's aggressive behavior toward Thomas. The vendor, Miguel Santos, confirmed he had never reported any theft, and medical records documented Thomas's injuries. District Attorney Walsh quietly dropped all charges against Thomas Mitchell, while Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into the officer's conduct. Both Martinez and Sullivan were suspended pending review. Jonathan Richardson found himself profoundly changed by his daughter's courage. That evening, as they sat in their luxurious living room, Emma asked the question that would define everything that followed. Daddy, what happens to Mr. Thomas now? He doesn't have anywhere to live, and those mean policemen might try to hurt other people too. Jonathan looked at his 7-year-old daughter, seeing in her eyes the same moral clarity that had driven her to stand up in court. What do you think we should do, sweetheart? I think we should help him. Really help him. Not just feel sorry for him. That night, Jonathan made a series of phone calls that would transform multiple lives. He contacted his corporate attorney, his human resources director, and his personal assistant. By morning, he had a plan that would either be seen as brilliant corporate social responsibility or complete business madness. The next day, Jonathan visited Thomas at the homeless shelter where he was staying temporarily. Thomas looked surprised to see the wealthy businessman who had supported his daughter's testimony. Mr. Richardson, I can't thank you enough for what Emma did. She saved my life. Thomas, my daughter believes in you, and frankly, so do I. I've done some research into your background. You were a maintenance supervisor for 23 years before your company went bankrupt. You have skills, experience, and a work ethic that most people would envy. Thomas looked confused. I appreciate that, sir, but at my age, with my situation, what if I told you that wasn't a problem? What if I told you that Richardson Industries has an opening for a facilities manager at our downtown headquarters? Full salary, benefits, and employee housing assistance. Thomas stared at Jonathan in shock. Sir, I don't understand. Why would you? Because my daughter taught me something important about seeing people for who they really are. not just their circumstances, and because I believe everyone deserves a second chance when they're willing to work for it. 3 weeks later, Thomas Mitchell walked into Richardson Industries wearing a new suit and carrying himself with the dignity of someone who had been given hope. His first day was watched carefully by employees who had heard the story of Emma's courtroom testimony, but Thomas quickly proved that Jonathan's faith in him was well placed. Emma visited the office that day, beaming with pride as she watched Thomas in his new role. "See, Daddy, I told you Mr. Thomas was a good person," Jonathan smiled. Realizing that his daughter had taught him more about business success than any MBA program ever could. Sometimes the best investments weren't measured in profit margins, but in human potential. 6 months after Thomas Mitchell started working at Richardson Industries, the transformation was remarkable. Not only had Thomas excelled in his role as facilities manager, but his story had inspired Jonathan to implement a company-wide hiring initiative for people experiencing homelessness. The Richardson Second Chance program became a model for corporate social responsibility, earning the company national recognition and, surprisingly, improved employee morale and productivity. Emma, now 8 years old, had become something of a celebrity at her school. Teachers used her story to discuss courage, justice, and standing up for others. But Emma herself remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. "Daddy," she said one evening as they prepared for their traditional Saturday morning walk, "do you think there are other people like Mr. Thomas who need help?" Jonathan smiled. His daughter's question had become the driving force behind his business decisions over the past months. "I'm sure there are, sweetheart. What do you think we should do about it?" "I think we should keep looking for them." The next morning, their walk took them past the same bench where they had first encountered Thomas. A small plaque had been installed there, reading, "In memory of Margaret Richardson, who taught her granddaughter that kindness is the most important kind of strength." As they paused to read the plaque, Emma noticed a young woman sitting on a nearby bench, holding a small child and looking lost and frightened. "Daddy," Emma said quietly, "she looks like she needs help." Jonathan followed his daughter's gaze and felt the familiar tug of recognition. Here was another opportunity to practice what Emma had taught him about seeing people who needed help. "Should we go talk to her?" Emma asked. Jonathan nodded, taking his daughter's hand. "Yes, I think we should." As they approached the young woman, Jonathan realized that Emma had forever changed not just how he saw the world, but how he moved through it. His daughter had taught him that true success wasn't measured by wealth or power, but by the willingness to use whatever advantages you had to lift others up. The young woman looked up as they approached, her eyes showing the same wariness that Thomas had displayed months earlier. But Emma's gentle smile and Jonathan's newfound understanding of how to offer help without judgment created space for another life to be transformed. "Hi," Emma said simply. "I'm Emma, and this is my daddy. Are you okay?" And so began another chapter in what had become the Richardson family's mission to prove that kindness, when paired with action, could indeed change the world one person at a time. The little girl who had refused to stay silent about injustice had grown into a young person who actively sought opportunities to create justice. 1 year after the courtroom incident, Thomas Mitchell stood before a crowd of business leaders and social workers at the Richardson Industries annual meeting. As the keynote speaker, he was there to share his story and the impact of the Second Chance program. 12 months ago, I was invisible," Thomas began, his voice steady and strong. "I was a man society had written off, someone that people crossed the street to avoid. But a 7-year-old girl saw me as a human being worthy of dignity and respect." In the audience, Emma sat between her parents. Her mother Sarah had returned from a business trip to attend this special day. beaming with pride as her friend Thomas addressed the room. The Richardson Second Chance program has now hired 47 individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Our retention rate is 92%, and our productivity metrics exceed industry standards. But more importantly, we've learned that when you invest in people's potential rather than just their credentials, everybody wins. Jonathan watched Thomas with deep satisfaction. The program had indeed become a business success, generating positive publicity, improving employee engagement, and even reducing operational costs through Thomas's innovative efficiency improvements. After the presentation, a reporter approached Emma for an interview. "Emma, how does it feel to know that your actions in that courtroom led to all this?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I think Mr. Thomas would have been a good person with or without me. I just helped people see what was already there." "Do you think you'll become a lawyer when you grow up?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'll just keep looking for people who need someone to believe in them." That evening, the Richardson family hosted a celebration dinner for Thomas and the other Second Chance program employees. As Emma looked around the table at the faces of people whose lives had been transformed, she felt grateful for the lesson her grandmother had taught her about speaking up for others. "Emma," Thomas said during dinner, "I have something for you." He pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a photograph in a silver frame. The same photograph he had been clutching that morning in the park when Officer Martinez stepped on his hand. "This is my daughter, Lisa. She graduated from college the year before I lost my job. She died in a car accident 2 months before we met you in the park." Emma studied the photograph of the young woman in the graduation cap and gown. "She looks kind, like you." "She was. And I think she would have loved you. You have the same brave heart she had." Thomas paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Emma, when those officers were hurting me that day, I had given up hope. I thought the world had no place for someone like me. But you showed me that there are still people who care about doing what's right, regardless of the cost." Emma reached across the table and took Thomas's weathered hand in her small one. "Mr. Thomas, you taught me something too. You taught me that good people can have bad things happen to them, and that doesn't make them less good. It just means they need friends." As the evening wound down and the guests prepared to leave, Jonathan reflected on how much his life had changed since that October morning in the park. His company was more successful than ever, but more importantly, it was a force for positive change in the community. Most remarkably, his daughter had become his most trusted advisor on matters of corporate social responsibility. Her insights valued by executives 3 times her age. Emma Richardson had learned that standing up for justice wasn't a single act of courage, but a way of living that required constant attention to the needs of others. 2 years after Emma's testimony, the impact continued to ripple outward. Officers Martinez and Sullivan had been dismissed from the police force, and their case had led to new training protocols about respectful treatment of homeless individuals. Emma, now 9, had become a sought-after speaker at children's rights conferences, though Jonathan carefully limited her appearances to protect her childhood. On this particular morning, Emma received a letter that would prove especially meaningful. It was from a girl named Sophie Chen in San Francisco who had seen Emma's story on the news. "Dear Emma," the letter read, "I saw what you did for Mr. Thomas, and it made me brave enough to tell my teacher about a kid in my class who was being bullied. Because of you, I learned that even kids can stand up for what's right. Thank you for showing me how to be brave." Emma read the letter twice, then showed it to her father. "Daddy, this girl says I helped her be brave, but I wasn't trying to help other kids. I was just trying to help Mr. Thomas." Jonathan smiled at his daughter's innocence. "Sometimes, sweetheart, when you do the right thing, it inspires other people to do the right thing too. It's like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples spread out farther than you can see." So maybe if Sophie helps someone, and that person helps someone else. Exactly. Your courage in that courtroom didn't just help Thomas. It started something bigger. That afternoon, Emma asked her father if they could visit the courthouse where she had testified. She wanted to see it again, to remember what it had felt like to stand up and speak the truth even when she was scared. Judge Hartwell happened to be in her chambers and agreed to see them. She remembered Emma clearly, the 7-year-old who had disrupted her courtroom and changed the trajectory of a case. "Emma," Judge Hartwell said, "do you know that your testimony that day has been used in training programs for new judges? We teach them about the importance of listening to all witnesses, regardless of age." "Really?" "I just told the truth." "Yes, but you told it at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. You reminded all of us that justice isn't about following rules blindly. It's about making sure the truth gets heard." On the drive home, Emma was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke up. "Daddy, I understand now why Grandma always said that doing the right thing creates more right things. When I helped Mr. Thomas, it helped you become a better person. When you started the Second Chance program, it helped lots of other people. When people heard our story, it helped them be braver too." Jonathan felt a surge of pride in his daughter's growing wisdom. "That's exactly right, Emma. Good actions create more good actions. Then I want to keep creating good actions for my whole life." As they pulled into their driveway, Jonathan realized that his daughter had articulated the philosophy that now guided their entire family. They had learned that privilege wasn't just about having advantages, it was about using those advantages to create opportunities for others. Emma Richardson, who had started as a child who simply couldn't bear to watch someone being hurt, had evolved into a young person who understood that creating justice was an ongoing responsibility, not a single heroic act. 3 years after the park incident, Emma Richardson, now 10 years old, stood before the United Nations Children's Assembly as the youngest keynote speaker in the organization's history. Her topic: "How Children Can Change the World by Speaking Truth." "When I was 7, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the assembly hall, "I saw something that was wrong, and I couldn't stay quiet about it. I didn't know that speaking up would change so many lives, including my own." In the audience, Thomas Mitchell sat with Jonathan and Sarah Richardson. Watching the girl who had saved his life addressed delegates from around the world. "I've learned that adults sometimes forget to see people who are different from them, but children are really good at seeing when someone needs help, because we haven't learned yet that some people don't matter." Emma paused, looking out at the sea of faces, listening to her words. Every child in this room has seen something that wasn't fair. Maybe it was bullying at school, or someone being mean to a person who looked different, or someone in your community who needed help but wasn't getting it. She opened the small notebook she always carried, the same one where she had first written down her memories of the park incident. "I want to tell you about the letters I get from kids all over the world, kids who stood up to bullies after hearing my story, kids who convinced their parents to help homeless people in their cities, kids who spoke up when they saw adults being unfair." Emma smiled, thinking of Sophie Chen and the hundreds of other children who had written to her. The thing about speaking truth is that it's contagious. When one person is brave enough to say what's right, it makes other people brave too. And when enough people start telling the truth about what's wrong, the world has to listen. After her speech, Emma was approached by a young delegate from Kenya named Amara, who was 12 years old. "Emma, in my country, children who speak up are often not heard. How do we make adults listen?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I think adults listen when they see that we're not just complaining, but when we're trying to help solve problems. When I testified for Mr. Thomas, I wasn't just saying the police were wrong, I was trying to help an innocent person. So we should always have solutions, not just complaints. I think so, and we should never give up, even when adults tell us we're too young to understand. That evening, at the reception following her speech, Emma found herself in conversation with diplomats and world leaders who wanted to understand how a child's perspective could contribute to solving global problems. "Miss Richardson," asked the ambassador from Norway, "what do you think is the most important thing adults need to learn from children?" Emma thought for a moment. "I think adults need to remember that fair is fair, no matter who's involved. Kids understand fairness really well because we haven't learned all the complicated reasons why unfair things are supposed to be okay." As the evening concluded, Thomas approached Emma with tears in his eyes. "Emma, when I watch you speaking to all these important people, I remember that little girl who wrapped her arms around me and promised to tell everyone the truth. You kept that promise in ways I never could have imagined." Emma hugged Thomas tightly. "Mr. Thomas, you taught me that helping one person can change everything. Now I'm trying to help lots of people understand that." Flying home from New York, Emma sat between her parents, looking out at the clouds below. She was thinking about all the children around the world who had written to her, who had found courage in her story to speak up for others. "Daddy," she said quietly, "I think Grandma would be proud of what we've built together." "I know she would, sweetheart, but mostly, I think she'd be proud of who you've become." Emma smiled. Already planning the next project for the Richardson Foundation for Children's Justice, an organization she and her father had started to support kids who wanted to make a difference in their communities. The 7-year-old who had refused to let injustice pass unchallenged had grown into a 10-year-old who was teaching the world that children's voices matter in the fight for justice. 5 years had passed since that transformative October morning in Central Park. Emma Richardson, now 12, stood once again in the same spot where she had first encountered Thomas Mitchell. But this time, she wasn't there as a witness to injustice. She was there for the dedication of the Thomas Mitchell Community Center, a facility funded by Richardson Industries to provide services for homeless individuals and families. Thomas, now 58 and the center's director, addressed the crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony. "5 years ago, I was a broken man who had lost hope in humanity. Today, I stand before you not just as someone who was helped, but as someone who gets to help others every day." The center, housed in a renovated building downtown, offered job training, temporary housing, medical services, and most importantly, dignity to people experiencing homelessness. This center exists because a 7-year-old girl refused to let cruelty go unchallenged, Thomas continued. "Emma Richardson taught all of us, that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together." In the 5 years since Emma's testimony, the Richardson Second Chance program had expanded to 12 cities, hiring over 300 formerly homeless individuals. The model had been copied by dozens of other companies, creating a nationwide movement. Emma, now an 8th grader who split her time between regular school and advocacy work, had published a children's book titled "Speaking Up, A Kid's Guide to Changing the World." The proceeds funded similar programs in other countries. "Emma," asked a reporter after the ceremony, "when you were 7 years old, did you imagine that speaking up for one person would lead to all this?" Emma, poised and thoughtful at 12, smiled. "I never imagined any of this. I just knew that Mr. Thomas was a good person who didn't deserve to be hurt. But I've learned that when you do something because it's right, not because of what might happen, amazing things can grow from it." The reporter pressed further. "What advice would you give to other children who see injustice but are afraid to speak up?" "I'd tell them that being afraid is normal. I was terrified in that courtroom. But I'd also tell them that staying silent when someone needs help is scarier than speaking up. Because if you don't speak up, you have to live with knowing you could have helped but didn't." That evening, the Richardson family hosted a celebration dinner at their home. The guest list included Thomas and his new wife, Maria, whom he had met at the community center, dozens of Second Chance program employees, Judge Hartwell, and even Sophie Chen, who had flown in from San Francisco with her parents. Sophie, now 11, had started her own anti-bullying program at her school, inspired by Emma's example. "Emma," Sophie said during dinner, "remember when I wrote you that letter about being brave?" "Of course I remember." "Well, my anti-bullying program has helped 43 kids in just 2 years, and 3 of those kids have started programs at their schools too." Emma smiled, understanding once again how acts of courage rippled outward in ways no one could predict. As the evening wound down, Emma found herself alone with Thomas in her father's study, looking at the wall of awards the Richardson Foundation had received for their social justice work. "Mr. Thomas," Emma said, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen you that day in the park." Thomas shook his head gently. "Emma, I don't think it was an accident that you were there. I think your grandmother was right. Sometimes the universe puts the right people in the right place at exactly the right time." He paused, looking at the young woman Emma was becoming. "But here's what I know for certain. You didn't just save my life that day. You saved my soul. You reminded me that I was worth saving. And that gave me the strength to rebuild everything I had lost." Emma hugged Thomas, thinking about the ripple effects of that single act of courage 5 years ago. As she prepared for bed that night, Emma wrote in the journal she had kept since the park incident, "Today I learned that when you plant seeds of justice, you never know how big the forest will grow. Mr. Thomas isn't just successful now, he's helping other people become successful too. And all those people will help other people, and it will keep going forever." She paused, thinking about tomorrow's plans to visit a school in Chicago, where students had requested help starting their own justice program. "Grandma always said that the most important thing you can do with your life is leave the world a little better than you found it. I think we're doing that, and I think we're just getting started." The fool. Outside Emma's window, Central Park stretched out under the stars, including the bench where a 7-year-old's courage had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. The ripples of that moment continued to spread, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the power to transform the world. Emma Richardson had learned that justice wasn't just about speaking up once. It was about building a life dedicated to ensuring that everyone's voice could be heard and that everyone's dignity could be protected. The little girl who couldn't bear to watch someone being hurt had grown into a young woman committed to preventing such hurt wherever she found it, one act of courage at a time.